This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 319 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. This one's about homestays when you travel. I'm putting this podcast together today on Noongar Boodja, so I'd like to pay my respects to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. Now, I can't believe I have got up to episode 319 and never devoted one to homestays before, because I have had some fabulous homestay experiences myself. So I do have two guests and their thoughts on homestays to share later in the episode. But first of all, you get me, because I wanted to tell you more about my homestay experiences in Russia. So I've homestayed in a few places, but by far the majority were on my two trips to Russia, and they're crazily long ago now. One in 2003 on the Trans-Siberian, and one in 2005 in Moscow and St Petersburg with my mum. But yeah, we often, homestays seem to be a great way to do that, to do Russia, so to speak. And from my very first experience, it proved true. There were nearly always widows that we stayed with. Apparently, Russia still has, but especially kind of in that era, had a really high kind of early death rate of men, or a very low life expectancy. I found a couple of stats. So in 1987, life expectancy for men in Russia was 65 years of age, which dropped quite dramatically. So by 1994, life expectancy was only 57. It's now on its way back up. But for my homestays, kind of 10 years later than the low of 57 years life expectancy, it makes a lot of sense to me that I came across a lot of women in their 50s and 60s who needed some extra income, and so were renting out rooms in their homes for homestays. And of course, some of them were doing it, I'm sure, just mostly for some income. But the vast majority of the homestays I stayed in, they were definitely also interested in foreigners and happy to chat, and even if they didn't speak English. So we had some amazing experiences. So I have gone back to my precious travel diaries so that I could remember some of the highlights. And I'm always so grateful to former Amanda for writing in these journals. Sometimes I wrote down weird things, but on the whole, I do always remember more when I'm able to go back and have a look. So my first trip to Russia was in 2003 and took the Trans-Siberian train across Russia from east to west, starting in Vladivostok. So I stayed in homestays in Vladivostok and Irkutsk, Yekaterinburg, Moscow, and then we went up to St Petersburg as well. So my very first homestay ever, oh no, that's not true, I homestayed as a teenager, but as an adult in 2003 we stayed with Tanya in Vladivostok. I will never forget walking into her apartment and seeing in the entrance, the separate kind of entrance area to her apartment, this long rack of the thickest, furriest winter coats I have ever seen in my life. And I just couldn't imagine. And she explained, yes, sometimes it'll be minus 40 degrees here and we'll have no electricity. So, yeah, we need these very thick, furry coats. And I was very glad that I was there in summer and not winter. And she was fabulous, Tanya. She also made delicious homemade jams. I read that in my diary and I could immediately taste them. But she had really good English and loved to chat. And was super interesting. I remember vividly having a really interesting discussion with her about her views on socialism and capitalism. She brought it up. And it was the first of many people who grew up in the Soviet era to tell me like a variation of this, especially when I lived and worked in Slovakia. I heard this a lot too. All I want is just a normal life. And sort of those massive changes especially over the 1990s, had made it not normal. So yeah, it was always interesting because we were, brought up to imagine that Soviet times were terrible in all ways, but they, for them it was just normal life, and disrupted normal life is not always that fun. From there, my next homestay was in Irkutsk, and we were hosted by a more shy woman named Nadia. and she would appear with meals and then kind of disappear, even though, it was only an apartment you'd think you could find her. But eventually we learnt to hunt her down after meals, and then she was actually super pleased when we complimented her meals with our limited Russian and lots of sign language. So I think she just didn't speak much English. And I think from memory she was very new to homestay as well. So fair enough. We then had a really cool homestay in Yekaterinburg, and it was a homestay family, middle-aged couple with 2 young adult daughters, but the parents actually, it was like the weekend or something, and they took off to their country house, so they were kind of more well-off, a more well-off family, and I think they took in homestay people more for the interest's sake than the income. And so their 2 young adult daughters, which were then about my age, hung out with us, cooked for us, or we cooked with them or helped, etc. And, walked into town with us or took the bus and stuff. And yeah, it was great to hear their perspective being a similar age. And we then moved on to Moscow and had the very interesting Zina hosting us. She had previously worked in the Kremlin and worked as a translator of books, so from Russian into English. So she had excellent English, and she helped us get reasonably priced tickets to the Bolshoi Ballet to see Cinderella there at the Bolshoi, which is pretty cool. And such lovely, lovely memories. And of course, this is back, pre-phone and definitely pre-selfie days. So we don't, nowadays, of course, if you stayed with people like that, you'd all take photos, but we didn't. And so I have to rely on my memory, but it's funny. So those were some of those initial homestays. And then on the back of this fabulous trip, I then decided, my mum and I decided we'd go to Russia together a couple of years later. So when I was a teenager, my mum, who had always been interested in the Russian language, decided she would learn Russian. So she spent several years learning Russian, which was, while I was in high school. So it was just a normal part of life for me that my mum would go off to her Russian class and she would do her homework while I was doing mine. So it seemed like a natural progression to then take her to Russia. I was living in Germany at the time, so we went together from Germany over to Russia, and we landed in Moscow to start with, and we had we were meant to be staying with Olga, good Russian name, and it turned out that the day before we arrived, I think she wound up in hospital, but she didn't cancel our stay. She organised it beautifully, and she had a beautiful neighbour, Nina, who greeted us and, showed us around the flat and our room there and walked us to the supermarket, etc., etc. She was delightful. And then Olga's son was still living there. His name was Nick, and he was responsible for cooking our breakfast and, being around. And he was... that turned out to be different but fabulous. And Olga, the host who was in hospital, actually even phoned us from the hospital to check we were doing okay. She spoke good English. So it was absolutely fine. Now, I asked my mum about some of her highlights from this trip, and she sent me an extract from her diary, also about Nick, this young journalist. He made quite the impression on us, the son. And I'll just read an extract from my mum's diary. So she said, Nick was cool. He tried to ask us about leaving, but his English is not at all good. I was able, in Russian, to tell him we were leaving at midnight. Could we leave our bags and come back to the apartment to collect them and leave around 9 p.m? And he was happy and understood. So I asked about the keys, and he showed us where to leave them. Very cool. Amanda did not even understand what I said. A great feeling for me. And it's true. I was very impressed because before that I'd always been the one who who was able to get by in other languages, whether we'd been in Germany together or Japan. And yes, to see my mum managing all of this in Russian was very cool. And our final homestay on that trip was Valentina in St Petersburg. She had this lovely flat really close to central St Petersburg. We could walk to most places we needed to go. Her English wasn't fabulous, but it was enough. And with my mum there, then we managed to get by quite well. I remember her cooking us different kinds of blini for breakfast every morning. And she memorably recommended this bistro restaurant named Lima for lunch on our first day. She said it was inexpensive. And we had the best chewy rye garlic bread there, and you could take away. So we brought some home for our snack every night. And I had this amazing eggplant dish every day, and so good. So so my mum got to practice her Russian even more with Valentina, And we had lots of hugs when we finally left, and we do have photos with her. I'll share some in the show notes. But yeah, that was super special again to be able to get a bit more of an insight into what Russian life was like. And that, for me, as my guests will reiterate, is one of the reasons homestays are so fabulous, because it's I always like to be able to connect with local people when you travel, but to stay in their homes is like the ultimate way to connect. And yeah, sure, it's not luxury, and we're on like folder beds crammed into an office or whatever, but I would take that any time over a luxury hotel, because the experience is so much more interesting, especially in a country where it's really different to home. So I asked some more guests about this topic as well, and my first one today is Nina Karnikowski, and we had been talking about eco-accommodation, which you might have heard in a previous episode, and that brought us to the topic of homestays.
For one of my books called Go Lightly, I interviewed about 10 really well-known eco-travelers, and one of them he's this really extreme activist. His name is Rob Greenfield, and he did things like traveling all the way across America on a bamboo bike that he built, and, for instance, spent a few weeks walking around New York in a suit made of the trash that an average American would produce in a week.
Wow.
Just in order to get people's heads around all of these issues. Now, when I asked Rob, what do you think the most eco way of traveling is, he brought up the fact that it's staying in people's houses, because he said, when you think about it, if you're staying in a hotel and you're just moving through night after night, new guests, however many rooms they have, think about all the washing, all the resources, all of those things that go into that. He said when you're staying at somebody's house, it automatically reduces all of that, because you're staying in a family home, you'll be staying for longer, they already probably had that bed made up, all those sorts of things. So you're automatically kind of bringing your carbon footprint down. But again, it is that immersion in the local life and developing a relationship with somebody in a place that will stay with you for a very long time, because there's nothing more intimate than staying in somebody's house with them. I had an experience in India last year, and it wasn't a traditional, I don't think you could describe it as a traditional homestay experience, but I spent a week with, it's an ethical fashion atelier called Sahili Women, run by a really beautiful Indian woman named Madhu Vaishnav, who's, she speaks at the UN. She's just such a powerhouse. She started this business with $100. She just wanted to bring Indian handcraft techniques back to the village that her husband's family were from. She had this dream of doing that, and she's now got more than 100 women working for her.
Wow.
She's reviving things like hand loom and hand embroidery, and these women, spending the week with them, I cannot tell you, it was just the most powerful experience I've had, even though I couldn't speak with any of them except for Madhu, because none of them spoke English, which was just a whole other level of
immersion.
Learning to communicate. Yeah, exactly. And I spent most of the week staying at her home. So that's hugely intimate. I mean, you're eating every single meal with them. That she was teaching me how to cook. We would cook together. She would kind of help me get dressed in the morning and tell me things about, this is the way you should dress for where we're going today. She would take me to her cousin's house for big dinner one night. And then one very special night, we decided to have a sleepover at the atelier in the village,
wow,
which was a 2-hour drive away from her home. And because it's in the center of this local village, all the local women, we got one of those Indian charpoy beds and carried it up onto this rooftop because it was really hot. And all the women came with us. There must have been 15 women and, some kids as well. They put the beds up there for Madhu and myself. And we lay there. I thought, oh, are we all going to sleep up here? And the women just sat on the beds with us, gossiping away in Marwari, the Indian, the dialect there. And the kids were sort of laughing at me most of the time. We're looking at the stars. I had no idea what was going on. And eventually they did go and we fell asleep. But it was just such a beautiful experience. And I thought you never, ever would get that in a hotel. You don't have that type of immersion in local culture. And I have such a strong relationship with Madhu and the Saheli women now that will last for a lifetime. Whatever they might need, I'm there. If they want to help with anything, I can help. I think that is a very, very powerful way to give back and also to have less of a footprint when you're doing it.
Such a beautiful experience. I want to be there sleeping on the rooftop. It sounds amazing. I later in our conversation then did ask Nina to speak more about the personal benefits of using homestay accommodation.
Yeah, and I think it's daunting for a lot of people. I think a lot of people think it's because it is definitely a lot more intimate. I guess there's this side of travel where people just want the cleanliness almost of a hotel in terms of the interaction. Oh, then I can kind of go off and do what I want and I'm not beholden to anybody or anything like that. But I think that is another benefit of the homestay experience is that it stretches you. It stretches you in a lot of kind of very personal ways in terms of how you interact with people and what it means to have a reciprocal relationship with somebody that you're staying with. All those things that it's easy to kind of turn away from when you're staying in a hotel. So I think that's another real benefit of it.
So many good things that can happen. I feel like I want a homestay all the time now. It's not that practical, but sometimes I've got to do more of it at least. Now, my final guest today is Iris Villarreal, and we chatted about some homestay experiences she had had in Guatemala.
I've done quite a few homestays with indigenous people, also in like Guatemala. And first of all, people when travel, of course, there's been a tendency to stay in hotels and hostels and whatnot. But I find that sometimes the direct contribution to a community can be done by, it's a win-win because you get to explore and experience the culture in a much more direct way. Mm-hmm. But also I feel that the communities or the families, even directly, or the person who you get to stay with, benefits from you being there. Well, it's not a new concept, but definitely it's surfaced a lot more, I would say, in the last few years. I think, from there, it's only win-win, really. Because sometimes maybe the language is a barrier if you don't speak the language. But these days you have offline Google Translate.
Yes.
So worst case scenario, you can literally talk into your phone and it translates into the language. And I think it's a beautiful way of sharing, even though if it's like with this maybe middle device in between. But if you can speak the language, then that's amazing. Well, I'm going to describe a little bit in specifically Guatemala, where I had the opportunity of staying with some families in some villages. Then literally you see what they eat, how they live, what they do. You can have, some of the questions that sometimes nobody can answer. Hey, how do you do this or how do you do that? You really also see how they dress. So everything that at least that I want to see from a cultural experience when you're trying to find out something about a different culture or different people. Then for me, it was nice to have dinner and talk about everyday topics and say, but how do you manage to do this? Or how do you survive? What do you do in your family? Their diet, especially people of indigenous origin in the whole of Latin America, but I stayed specifically with an indigenous family. Corn is like their bread, so their entire diet is heavily based on corn. They make these flat tortillas. The indigenous people, they use a lot of corn, they use a lot of beans, they use things that existed there before the influence of the Spanish.
Yeah, learning about what people really eat and their everyday ideas of, their actual staple diet is definitely an interesting part of homestays. I also asked Iris to more generally tell me why she recommends homestay experiences.
Well, first of all, you really see from the very ground how people are living. You go to their house, right? I mean, I'm sure there's a variation in homestays, but a lot of people are quite humble. I think it makes you appreciate what you have at home more.
True.
The facilities and the things that you get for granted. Well, at least in the places where I have been, I'm sure you can go to places in the West where you will just find pretty much things similar to your own. But in places where people are more humble in terms of resources, then it makes you really appreciate what you have. Like the food is one thing, running water is another thing. The hardships that people have to go through when you get into conversations, you're like, wow, my life is easy here.
Yeah.
A lot of people are they are working in the field, or they are rearing animals, or they are having very early starts. And the places where I've been, people would wake up at 4 in the morning. The man would have to go up somewhere in a mountain to work the land from early hours. Okay, the kids go to school. The mother wakes up and has to grind the corn that they would use, because they use it actually fresh. So they grind the corn, they start preparing the ingredients. People, I'm talking about specifically like the Guatemala, places in Guatemala. People sometimes have stoves, but they still love cooking with wood. So they have also like a real firewood type of stove where they make their tortillas and everything. So they all have very early starts. And when you start having conversations with them, you understand that their life is actually pretty hard compared to yours, for example.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
I think, one thing I've really learned from travel is wherever you go, there would be things that are maybe done in at least, don't know what standards everybody has, but you would see things that are done maybe worse than the way you do them, and there will be things that maybe will be done better than the way you do them.
Mm-hmm.
And so my approach always has been that when you see, not worse, maybe worse is not a good word, but
differently,
when you have it easy or differently, but when you see something somewhere and you say, wow, I have it much better, then I think you should makes you reflect, oh wow, I'm grateful because I have this and it's so much easier for me, and they actually don't have it.
Mm-hmm.
Or life is much harder, people have it just differently, and wow, it makes me aware of these things that I have. That's kind of one way. And when things are done in a way better than I do them back home, then that's also a place for learning, because I say, wow, I can do this like this maybe. It gives me a different perspective on how to do something or on how to look at something.
So let's get out there, everybody. I want to do some more homestays, and I hope that I've inspired you too. I'd love to hear about your own homestay experiences, so do come along to our Thoughtful Travellers groups, either our Facebook group or our LinkedIn group, and tell us what your experience was. Thank you so much for listening to episode 319 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. A big shout out to my guests, or also a big thanks to my mum for her input, and to our guests, Nina Karnikowski, and you can find out more about her and her books. And heads up, we are actually going to be reading her book, The Mindful Traveller, for the Thoughtful Travellers Book Club imminently. It's our current book, in fact, so keep an eye out for more details about that. You can find out more at ninakarnikowski.com. And also thanks to Iris Villarreal, and you can find out more about her from her Instagram at instagram.com/outventurenow. That's outventurenow. I'll also leave links in the show notes to those Facebook and LinkedIn groups. And don't forget to sign up for the Thoughtful Travellers newsletter at Substack. You can just go to thoughtfultravel.substack.com. And all of these links and more, including some pictures from our Russian homestay experiences, will be in the show notes. And for this episode, they'll be at notaballerina.com/319. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.